Welcome back for this week's episode, which is Real Railroads, Episode 6, Genesee and Wyoming Beginnings. Most everyone is familiar with Genesee and Wyoming. Their orange, black, and yellow paint has slowly popped up in many states and even in other countries. But it started as a small short line in the 19th century in Gretzof, New York, just a few miles away. The story of the Genesee and Wyoming starts in 1859 with the discovery of oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania. The discovery of oil created a massive move to find oil elsewhere in the country, and drilling teams started looking for it. It took less than 20 years from them to look in New York. In 1878, a drilling team found the large salt deposit here in Wyoming County. These salt deposits led to the building of all the salt blocks in Warsaw, Rock Glen, Wyoming, and Silver Springs that today are mostly gone, with just a brine company in Wyoming and Morton Salt in Silver Springs working. Amateur geologist Carol Coker concluded that more salt could be found in Livingston County and convinced financier William J. Foster, Jr. to start a mining operation. The mine in the south of the town of York and what would become NY Route 63 grew a town around it. And that is right here, Gretzof. This community would be incorporated in the 1880s, named Gretzof, Foster spelled backwards. The Foster family would continue to own the salt mine in Gretzof until it was purchased by the Fuller family in 1890. In 1891, the railroad was finally built as the Genesee and Wyoming Valley, running a total of 4 miles. It extended from Gretzof east 2.5 miles to the western New York, Pennsylvania at Gretzof Junction, north of Beaufort. It's Beaufort, it's Gretzof Junction. It still shows the track going over there and up there, although it's abandoned. You can see the dotted line here is where it used to go, roughly. Went down through Cuylerville and on down to Mount Morris and up to Rochester that way. And west, 1.5 miles, which is here we go, that's off, 1.5 miles to Greggsville, or rather, Wadsworth, rather. The interchange to the Delaware, Lackawanna Western. Delaware, Lackawanna Western went up this way and curved off that way and went to Buffalo. And it went down this way, and that's still used. It took a few years for the Northern Line to be built. Some records state it was completed in April 1st, 1895, while others state it was sometime in 1899. No matter the date, the line was 10.7 miles long, extending from Gretzof due north to P&L Junction in Caledonia. This is also called the G&W Main Line. The G&W-V was the fifth and last railroad to reach Caledonia. This is also called reached Caledonia, and this connection allowed them to interchange with the Erie Railroad, Lehigh Valley, Buffalo, Rochester, and Pittsburgh, and New York Central. Also in 1899, the G&W-V was bankrupt, something that often happened in new railroads. Edward L. Fuller and his partners purchased the railroad and renamed it Genesee Wyoming Railroad Company, or GWRR. But kept it as a separate independent company from the salt mine. The Gretzof mine would grow to be the largest salt mine in the world, and at some point became known as the International Salt Company. By now, the Genesee and Wyoming interchange with 7 railroads: the Pennsylvania Gretzof Junction, the DL&W at Greggsville, Short Line Howlight and Northern in Gretzof, then the Erie, New York Central, Lehigh Valley, and BR&P in Caledonia on just 14.7 miles of track. The connection at Gretzof Junction became PR in 1900 when that railroad absorbed the original WYMP. The Howlight Northern was a small short line that ran from Gretzof south to outside Cuylerville, where the Sterling Salt Mine was located. It was an independent railroad until G&W leased it in 1912. Before this, the PR had exclusive access to the H&N. All salt from the Sterling Mine was simply bridge traffic on the G&W being picked up at Gretzof and hauled 2.5 miles to the PR interchange. When the H&N under G&W control, the salt would be shipped to all 6 Class 1 railroads they interchanged with. This enraged the PR, who took the case to court, insisting that the G&W and H&N were switching railroads and not common carriers and should not get part of the through rates that they would get hauling salt. The existence of the G&W hung in the balance until the case reached the Supreme Court, which ruled against the PRR and granted G&W status as a Class II common carrier, also known as a regional railroad. The G&W did provide passenger service on their system, but were also the first in the area to end passenger service in 1929. This was just one of three changes to the G&W to come. In 1932, the BRMP connection in Caledonia became Baltimore, Ohio, and in 1934, the G&W abandoned the Halight Northern. At this time, the G&W was 100% steam power. Dieselization came in 1945, and the railroad through the years had owned 18 steam locomotives, all of 060, 040, 440, 260, 460, and 280 wheel arrangement. Now the Sterling Salt Mine became part of International Salt, and they filled in the mine shaft in 1987. They filled it full of rock. There were a few accidents at the Sterling Salt Mine, which were explosions involving methane gas. One burned 50 men, some severely, and it's not. I haven't been able to find if anybody actually died. They said possibly lethal injuries, but in 1987 when they were filling it, they also had an explosion. That one killed 2 guys. One guy is missing. I don't think they ever found him, and it injured a couple others. Now the steam locomotives. Baldwin 060T number 1 was built new for the GWV in 1891 and remained in the property until 1982. Baldwin 040 number 2 was built in 1892, but it was acquired used. Don't know from who. Baldwin 040 number 3 was built for the GW in 1993, but only was on the property until 1908 when they sold it to the Buffalo Union Furnace Company. LVRR 440 number 4 was built in 1888 by Lehigh Valley and arrived in the G&W from them in 1898. Dixon 260 number 5 was built in 1883 for the Delaware and Hudson and sold to the G&W at some point after 1898. LVRR 440 number 6 was built in 1898. G&W purchased it in 1903 and scrapped it 6 years later in 1909. Elko 260 number 7 was built for G&W in 1905. In 1913, it was sold to the Birmingham Rail and Loco Company. Elko 260 number 8 was built in 1906 for G&W, but in 1920 was sold to the Southern Iron and Equipment Company in Atlanta, Georgia. Baldwin 260 number 9 was built in 1910. It is unknown what happened to the locomotive. Pitts 280 number 10 was built in 1900 for the Pittsburgh Lake Erie, arrived somewhere between 1910 and 1916. Brooks 280 number 11 was built in 1898 for the BRMP as a 480 Mastodon, was rebuilt in Du Bois as a 280 and eventually sold to the GW prior to 1916. Porter 280 number 12 was built for the G&W in 1916 and was scrapped in 1966. Baldwin 460 number 14 was built for the Buffalo and Susquehanna in 1894, arrived in the G&W in 1917. This locomotive was sold at some point, ending up on the Arcade in Attica in 1922 and was scrapped there in 1923. 260 number 15 was built in 1905. This locomotive, there was no record I could find telling who built it or its history. This would have been purchased used and was the GW's last used locomotive. Porter 260's number 16 and 17, built in 1920 for the G&W, weighed in at 69 tons, as had its number 12. The 16 was rebuilt in 1936 and were retired in 1945. The 16 was scrapped in 1956, while the 17 was on standby until 1956 and was scrapped in 1959. Porter 260 number 18 was built in 1922 for the G&W, also weighed 69 tons. It was sold in 1953 to General Crush Stone, which was a gravel pit in Leroy. I believe it's abandoned now. And remained in use until 1962 and was scrapped in 1967. Porter 260 number 19 was built in 1922 for the G&W, also a 69-ton locomotive, was scrapped at Gretzof around 1959. The first diesels in the G&W arrived in 1944 to 45. These were General Electric 80-ton switchers, number 20 in 1944 and 21 and 22 in 1945, in a similar orange and black as the scheme seen today. All steam was sidelined, but a couple locomotives could have been used as needed and possibly were at times. The next diesels to arrive were Elko RS1 number 25 in 1952, followed by RS1 number 30 in 1955 and S4 number 35 in 1959. During the 1960s and 70s, G&W started buying used locomotives again, renumbering 25 and 30 to 40 and 41, while acquiring RS1 42 in 1964 from New Haven. Around this time, they also acquired RS-1s 43 and 44 from the Chicago and Western Indiana. RS-1 number 44 was sold to Eastman Kodak in 1971, where it served as number 9 until it was donated to the Rochester and Genesee Valley Railroad Museum, who had preserved it. In 1976, in honor of the bicentennial, the G&W renumbered and repainted RS-1 41 to 1976. They had also acquired an Elko S4 from Penn Central or Conrail in 1976, which became number 1776 on delivery, but eventually was repainted orange and black and took the number 36. Now, during all these locomotive acquisitions, the railroad map had been changing. The NYC had already dead-ended the Peanut Line in 1938, ending at Caledonia instead of continuing east to Canandaigua. Erie had abandoned their line between Avon and Mount Morris in 1940 because of a connection future G&W property had made with competitor DL&W. In 1960, the DL&W and Erie merged to form Erie-Lackawanna, reducing G&W's connections to 5, NYC, LV, B&O, PRR, B&O, PRR, and EL. G&W had begun acquiring their own shell toppers in 1961, and in 1962 the PRR abandoned the former WNYP, previously the Genesee Valley Canal, once again knocking their connections down. The following year, the former DL&W became a branch line when EL abandoned Dansville Hill, a large grade over a large ridge above Dansville. In 1968, the G&W purchased the business car Edward I from New Haven, and there was the NYC-PRR merger to form the disaster, which was Penn Central. Rail traffic was declining as railroads struggled with regulations and competition from trucks. In 1972, the Chassis System Holding Company was formed, which controlled B&O, WM, and C&O, and on April 1, 1976, Conrail was formed, reducing the G&W connections once again down to just Conrail and B&O in Caledonia and Conrail in Greggsville. The Conrail era brought a massive change to Western New York and GW's connections to the outside world. With the enormous amount of duplicate track with LV, PEC, EL systems, they abandoned a lot of trackage. The Lehigh Valley and Erie-Lackawanna lines through Caledonia were abandoned. Conrail kept the dead-ended New York Central Peanut Line between Batavia and Caledonia, and the former DL&W between North Alexander and Greggsville for the time being. This kept G&W with a decent connection to the outside world, which was made better with Delaware and Hudson gaining trackage rights on the former DL&W to reach the G&W in Greggsville. In 1977, Mortimer B. Fuller III purchased controlling interest in G&W and formed the holding company known today, the Genesee and Wyoming Industries. It's changed name, but same company. The G&W was its first property, and the company started getting into the freight car leasing business, mainly covered hoppers for salt service. With the deregulation of the 1980 Staggers Act, Mortimer Fuller worked with NYSDOT, Baltimore, Ohio, and Delaware and Hudson on shaping the future of Conrail, stabilizing local rail industry, and improving efficiency for shipping from international salt, then the largest rail shipper in the world. Also in 1980, the well-known orange, black, and yellow paint is seen for the first time on the car body of EMD MP15DC switchers 45 and 46, which is the railroad's last locomotives bought new. 1982 brought more change to G&W as they purchased the former DL&W between Greggsville and the end of the line in Groveland Station. The rest of the tracks eastward had been abandoned by EL in 1963 and ripped up in 1965, and the only reason that Conrail kept the line to Groveland was the interchange of the 7.8-mile short line Dansville-Mount Morris, which served Foster Wheeler and Dansville. They made steam generators and stuff for those. Additionally, Conrail abandoned the former NYC Peanut Line between Batavia and Caledonia, reducing the G&W to only B&O in Caledonia and Conrail and D&H in Greggsville, as DMM was not connected to any other railroad. The current G&W family began on July 23, 1985, when Genesee Wyoming Industries purchased the Dansville and Mount Morris. At this point, the DMM basically ceased to exist. Their two 44-ton diesels lasted until October 1986, when they were sold to the Bay Colony Railroad. Also in 1985, the B&O sold the tracks from Gretzof Junction to Rochester to newly formed Rochester and Southern, which began operations as the GWI Company in 1986, using mostly lease power from the Chessie family, until acquiring 6 GB40 road switchers from Conrail. Also that year, Conrail abandoned the former DL&W between North Alexander and Greggsville, reducing G&W to only the connection with the newly formed R&S in Caledonia. However, D&H had an agreement with G&W, and there was even special power for just this agreement. G&W provided unit salt trains to D&H. These usually used a set of 3 Alco C42040 road switchers, thus cars for D&H would go north to P&L Junction, then turn south onto R&S trackage to reach the D&H and Conrail Southern Tier Line in Silver Springs. Plus, since G&W and R&S were subsidiaries of the same company, G&W trains began running north of Caledonia to Conrail in Rochester on the former B&O. GWI continued adding railroads to their company, the Louisiana and Delta in 1987, Buffalo and Pittsburgh in 1988, followed by Allegheny and Eastern, Bradford Industrial in 1982. In 1984, tragedy struck the Genesee, Wyoming. Its primary customer, now Axel Salt and Gretzof, collapsed and ceased operations. The entire area sank a couple feet, breaking roads and flooding the mine with water from an aquifer. Historical records cite a magnitude 3.6 earthquake for this, but the true reason is that the new owners had ignored proper safety precautions and had started removing salt ridges and pillars left in the mine to support the ground above. With the salt industry gone, G&W was left with only a couple of customers in the entire line, a cold storage company in Mount Morris and Foster Wheeler in Dansville. During this time, the G&W operated many other locomotives, which replaced the two Alco S4 switchers. Something's not right there. And 5 RS1 road switchers. 2 S2s and maybe 1 S4. A typographical error there. Besides the 2 MP15 DCs and 3 Alco C424s, they also had acquired 2 X-Conrail GP38s, 4 SW1001 switchers, 3 X-Conrail and 1, I'm not sure where that came from, and an SW1200 and 6 EMD SW1504s acquired from Mexico. The G&W and R&S power was intermixed, appearing on each other's trains, and BMP power started making its way onto the R&S and G&W. The holding company continued acquiring more railroads, spreading their corporate paint to Portland Western in 1995, followed by Illinois Midland and Pittsburgh and Chalmette in 1996, plus acquiring RailLink in 1996. The company was reorganized that same year, changing from Genesee Wyoming Industries to Genesee Wyoming Incorporated, and became a publicly traded company in June. They became an international company in 1997 with the acquisition of Huron Central Railway, Quebec Gantio Railway, and Australia Southern Railroad. The Genesee Wyoming Railroad, long struggling to survive with just the small customers, got a reprieve in 1998 when American Rock Salt opened a new salt mine in Hampton Corners, which required the construction of a branch line from just north of the former D&W passenger station in Mount Morris across the flats to the salt mine. They then assigned SW1001 switchers numbers 1000 and 1001 to the salt mine as industrial switchers, where they pretty much have stayed since, only leaving during routine maintenance. During the 1990s, the G&W power had pretty much disappeared. Only corporate painted MP15 DCs 45 and 46, GP38 number 51, and SW1001 1001, along with Conrail painted GP38 50 and SW1001 number 1002. They would also on occasion get the R&S GP40s 101 to 106, plus we're using 5 Buffalo and Pittsburgh GP9s and 2 GP18s in NW paint, a GP38 and SW1500 in corporate paint, and 2 more GP38s in Conrail paint, all lettered for BPRR. It wasn't long before the railroad would cease to exist. The company acquired a 50% stake in Australia Railroad Group in 2000, bought the South Buffalo Railroad in 2001, embargoed the former DMM trackage, and started purchasing 600 Trinity Rail 2-bay covered hoppers to replace their aging salt hopper fleet. In 2002, while GWI acquired Emmons Industries, bringing in 3 more railroads and Utah Railway, the railroad Genesee, Wyoming was officially merged into Rochester and Southern, ending over 100 years of the railroad. Some state it happened in 2000, but the majority of the information I found said 2002. GWR remains on only 2 locomotives. The SW1001 switchers 1000 and 1001 at the time. GP38 number 50 blew the main generator, is retired, unlikely to be rebuilt. The former GWR trackage is operated by GWI property or RSR today, with trains GW1 running to the mine and BL1, which switches the handful of industries in the former GWR and DMM trackage as needed. Genesee and Wyoming Incorporated, since 2002, has acquired over 100 more railroads, and today employs 7,300 people on 116 railroads, serving 3,000 customers worldwide. Many of these railroads were through the acquisition of holding companies Georgia Pacific Railroads in 2003, Rail Management Corporation in 2005, Ohio Central Railroad System in 2008, and Rail America in 2012. A massive company that started with a little short line that was almost killed by PRR. That concludes episode 6. Stay tuned for episode 7 next week.